Hello and welcome back to Miss Hannah Loves Grammar. In this video we're unpacking the short story The Yellow Wallpaper, written by Charlotte Perkins Gilman in 1890 and first published in 1892. It tells the struggle of a woman with her mental health. And Perkins Gilman rebutted people's concerns and alarm about this book by saying it was not intended to drive people crazy, but to save people from being driven crazy. And it worked. Before we dig into the brilliant Mr. Bertram's analysis, please do like this video, comment on this video, and more than anything, join our tribe by hitting subscribe for all things English, literary, and grammatical. Over to you, sir.
Before delving into this fascinating but complex story, it is first important to learn about the writer's background and the historical period that she was writing in. In the lead up to writing The Yellow Wallpaper, Gilman seemed to have a torrid time after possibly experiencing postpartum depression following the birth of her child in 1885. In her autobiography, she describes feeling a dragging weariness, absolute incapacity, absolute misery. Unfortunately for Gilman, during the 19th century, there was a complete lack of understanding of women's mental health. This was something that she personally experienced as a patient of Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, the father of American neuropsychology. Now, just a little information about this man. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, it was known as the golden age of hysteria. Hysteria being a well-known condition which involved emotionally charged behavior that was excessive and out of control. And this was seen as a female illness. Even semantically rooted in the Greek term hysteron, meaning womb. Many doctors in fact believed it to be caused by the uterus, which was why they concluded that men could not become hysterical. So for this female condition, Mitchell pioneered what he felt was the perfect remedy for it, and this was the rest cure, which involved complete isolation, and any academic or activities which required mental stimulation were strictly forbidden. Therefore, being treated for hysteria, which was actually depression, Gilman describes having to live a domestic life and to never touch pen, brush, or pencil again. This medical approach towards women is indicative of the period that Gilman was writing in. Often referred to as the Gilded Age, thanks to writers like Mark Twain, women were placed purely in the domestic sphere and were not encouraged to explore their ideas and creativity. However, the concept of the new woman began to emerge in the late 19th century, about the time Gilman was writing the story, which challenged this perception of women, which is arguably reflected in The Yellow Wallpaper. Obviously, Mitchell's rest cure was a complete failure, and if anything, made the condition worse. Gilman said herself, following her treatment, that she became so perilously near to losing her mind. The mental agony grew for her to the point that it was so unbearable that she would sit blankly moving her head from side to side. It is also worth noting that hysteria has since become less apparent in the medical profession and has been replaced by what it actually was all along, which is depression and anxiety. As soon as we begin reading The Yellow Wallpaper, we find that this fiction, in parts, can actually be viewed as autobiographical. There are uncanny similarities with Gilman's experiences and the narrator's. At the beginning of the story, we learn that the narrator is suffering from a slight hysterical tendency and as a result has been brought to a colonial mansion by her husband as a retreat to have perfect rest and is forbidden to work. Now this seems awfully familiar to Gilman's own experiences and the features of Mitchell's rest cure. Like Gilman, the narrator disagrees with the logic of the rest cure as a way to treat her depression. Again, in comparison to Gilman's own life, the narrator actually hints at the nature of her illness, and it is strikingly obvious that it is some form of postpartum psychosis that she's experiencing. When she remarks, "It is fortunate Mary is so good with the baby, such a dear baby, and yet I cannot be with him. It makes me so nervous." One could argue here that Mary is used as a symbolic representation of the Virgin Mary, presenting the character Mary in this story as the ideal mother in the 19th century, expected to be domesticated and care for her children. And yet the narrator finds herself almost imprisoned in this domestic sphere, which is very much a patriarchal household. The narrator remarks it's something strange about it and that it's haunted, which conjures ideas of the Gothic genre, containing mysterious settings, especially haunted houses or mansions, and also the presence of ghosts. And we wonder if this house, this retreat, has witnessed many other unfortunate women who have been imprisoned there in the past. But it also conjures this Gothic trope of the dominant superior male trapping the vulnerable woman in a domestic setting. This sense of confinement is furthered as John decides to place her at the top of the house on the 3rd floor, in a room which used to be a nursery with windows that are barred. Along with this imprisoning effect, it also infantilizes the narrator as a hysterical child who needs to be managed and controlled. The narrative style also, I think, is very clever from Gilman, as we only hear about this story from the writings of the narrator's journal, which she refers to as a dead paper, metaphorically describing the lack of autonomy women had to express themselves creatively and artistically. It also presents the subversive nature of the narrator, who is willing to reject the instructions from men, as writing serves as a great relief to her mind. So who is the dominant superior male character in this Gothic story? Well, that would be the narrator's husband, John. So what do we know about John? Well, he works in the medical profession as a physician and is the person who inaccurately diagnoses his wife's hysteria and replicates Mitchell's rest cure as a viable treatment. Therefore, he symbolically represents the male-dominated medical profession in the 19th century. John is a man of rationality. He's extremely practical and is the complete antithesis to his wife's fanciful nature. There seems to be not only a lack of understanding in this relationship, but also love. John uses medical jargon to describe his wife as his nervous patient, and the narrator talks about her scheduled prescriptions, which are obviously monitored by John, so it becomes apparent that John is not only a representation of the medical profession in the 19th century, but also the patriarchy. Here we have a man pathologizing female imagination and creativity as something that needs to be controlled and monitored carefully. We also get a hint of the power dynamic in their marriage, and one could argue that Gilman, in her story, is criticizing the institution of marriage in the 19th century as a way for husbands to demean their wives, something that the narrator is clearly aware of when we look at this description here. John often mocks and degrades her, laughing at her, using diminutive language, calling her a little goose and a little girl. This also speaks to the helpless position the narrator finds herself in. She often asks, what can she do? Representing the powerlessness that women had in the 19th century, based on society's strict gender roles. So, with a husband that is so devoid of emotional intelligence, it is unsurprising that the narrator's mental health begins to decline quite precipitously during the story. This becomes apparent through her fixation on the yellow wallpaper in her room, which is obviously the key symbol that is used in the story. So let's focus on the first description that we get of the yellow wallpaper, which captivates the narrator both by its design and colour. It's described as dull and irritates, but also provokes study. This paradoxical description of the paper is interesting here, as the wallpaper both repulses and intrigues the narrator, conjuring the Gothic idea of the uncanny, as the wallpaper offers something to her which is familiar and unfamiliar. Another way this could be interpreted, however, is that this paradox represents the female narrator's mind as it is perceived by a male medical profession in the 19th century, something which is scary and dangerous, but also fascinating and worthy of study. We then learn of the colour of the wallpaper, which has a pejorative effect on the narrator. The colour yellow is an interesting choice here from Gilman. Particularly in the 19th century, the colour yellow came to represent ideas of decay, and was also used by other Victorian writers such as Dickens for the same reasons and for the same effect in his novel such as Great Expectations. Yellow also has connotations of sickness. If we think about a medical condition called jaundice, which affects people's livers, it causes people to have a yellow discoloration of the eyes and skin. Thus, the yellow causes such loathing from the narrator as it arguably reflects her own mental state and illness. It causes her to also have a sensory overload as she describes the odorous smell that the paper also emits, what she describes as a yellow smell, which infiltrates and besmirches and stains people's clothing. Interestingly, it also stains the clothing of John, as if to suggest that he is also responsible for causing his wife's mental illness. Furthermore, Gilman continues to make this connection to the wallpaper and the threat of masculinity, as whenever the narrator stops and studies the wallpaper, the presence of John is often mentioned. So we get this impression that the wallpaper is a reflection of the narrator's mental illness, which is caused by or exacerbated by John, who is a representation of masculinity. The narrator's initial frustrations towards the wallpaper begins to gradually change as the story progresses. She develops a fondness towards it as it becomes her primary interest throughout the day. She identifies a female figure moving behind the paper, as the pattern of the paper often keeps her still. Gilman evokes the imagery of an oppressed, subdued woman here, and the intricate design of the paper could be a metaphor for the stringent societal structures which keep women at bay. At first it seems that this figure is separate to the narrator, which would obviously be our first impression, but as the story develops, we begin to see that they are connected. Towards the end of the story, the narrator wishes John would take her away from there. Not only does this speak to the lack of autonomy that she has, requiring permission to do what she pleases, but she also shares the same desires as the woman behind the wallpaper, as only a few lines later, the woman behind the wallpaper shakes the pattern as she wants to get out. Also, what is worth noting here is the fear of the male gaze which pervades the text. At night, the woman behind the wallpaper is active and often crawls around behind the pattern, shaking the bars, whereas in the daytime, she is subdued and quiet. Gilman cleverly uses the sun as a symbol of masculinity here to represent male oppression, and the moon as a symbol of femininity to represent perhaps the possibility of female liberation. Therefore, we begin to view the narrator and the woman behind the wallpaper more symbolically. The narrator being a representation perhaps of the physical entrapment and control of women's bodies as she is physically trapped in the house, and the woman behind the wallpaper representing the suppression of the minds of women, their creative and intellectual capabilities. On the day the family decide to leave the mansion, the narrator locks herself in her room and begins tearing off the wallpaper from the walls, stripping away the metaphorical bars in an attempt to free the woman behind the wallpaper, who, from another perspective, represents the narrator's own mind and intellect. Another reason why the woman behind the wallpaper may represent the narrator's mind is that we really only get descriptions of her physiognomy, in other words, her facial features, with her strangled head and bulbous eyes, which conjures imagery of death and suffocation, perhaps a metaphor for the suffocation of women's artistic and creative expression. But the narrator begins to see other women crawling outside as she hears the strangled heads scream as she tears off the wallpaper from the walls. She not only is concerned with freeing herself, but also other mentally trapped women, almost suggesting the idea that you cannot free others before you free yourself. This is also evident earlier in the story when Jenny, who is John's sister and housekeeper, notices that some of the wallpaper had been stripped off the walls by the narrator the day before. She says that she wants to do it herself, which speaks to the collective female desire to regain intellectual freedom from the oppressive patriarchal society. The ending of the short story is extremely ambiguous, and as the story draws to its close, we see a change in the narrator as she seemingly becomes more insane, but at the same time more defiant towards John's control over her. She wants to astonish him, emphasizing the needs of women to defy tradition and seek self-determination, until eventually the narrator manages to free the woman behind the wallpaper and the narrator merges with her, assuming a new identity, becoming a new woman, celebrating how she is free to creep around as she pleases in spite of John and Jane. Upon seeing this horrific sight, John faints to the ground. This can be interpreted literally as he fainted due to the shock of seeing his wife crawling around the floor in a manic fashion, or it could represent his figurative death and the death of his control and domination over her, especially since his wife literally crawls over his lifeless body almost, suggesting that she has become now the dominant figure. But ultimately, I think the purpose of this text is not to make people insane, as we heard at the beginning of this lecture, but to highlight the dangers of the misdiagnosis of women during the 19th century and highlight male ignorance and naivety towards women's mental health. I think Gilman is expressing the importance of creating an egalitarian society where women have the freedom and liberty to express themselves intellectually.